Hi everyone, welcome to the Synology Partner Online Training. Once again, we have an awesome topic for everyone here today, going over a hybrid file server deployment utilizing the Synology ecosystem. We're going to be focusing on some awesome new features inside of DSM7, like hybrid share, Synology C2 identity, as well as integrations with other services on the NAS like Synology Drive to help serve your remote workers even. Now, quick introduction, my name's Cody. I'm a product manager here at Synology, and I'm going to be your guide for this one this time around. Now today, one of the most critical components inside of your business's network is, of course, your file server. This is the component inside of your network that actually serves data out to you, the managers, as well as your workers. They will need to use this file server to pull necessary data to get their jobs done. Now, in the past, using a Synology NAS was an easy way to actually help shed some of the burden of having to scale a normal file server for your workers. With a Synology NAS, you can easily add expansion units and that kind of thing to increase your overall capacity, or you can upgrade to a larger, more powerful unit to serve more users as your business grows. Now today, we're going to be taking things even a step further. We're still going to use those great Synology NAS that are expandable, but this time we're also going to use some cloud features like Synology C2 Hybrid Share through Synology C2 Storage and C2 Identity to make sure permissions are synced across your entire organization. What this is going to ultimately achieve is a hybrid architecture that supports both your on-site users as well as your remote workers through Synology Drive. And through all this, it's going to make managing all of this a breeze because you're going to be able to take care of all the different settings and that kind of thing through one easy-to-use web portal, especially when it comes to your users and your permissions in C2 Identity. So let's get started. So this diagram is going to be our guide for today. We're actually going to be building out a similar setup to this as we work through today's session. Now, there's a couple different moving components here inside of this setup. You have different offices across the country, one on the West Coast and one on the East Coast. Each of those offices have NAS for their file server at those respective offices, and they have on-site users actually interacting with that NAS daily. Likewise, you also have some remote users throughout the country that need to have access to your data somehow. Lastly, you also have the Synology C2 storage and the data lake there that'll serve as the central hub for syncing between the offices and between those two NAS. Now, the on-site users are going to be mainly interacting with the local cache for your hybrid share folder. Now, what this local cache is it's a repository of data on the local NAS that represents your most frequently accessed data at that specific site. And so what that means is that each NAS at each location can have a unique pool of data inside of their local cache that they happen to access most frequently. Any changes, new data, all that stuff that is created on one side will first be brought into the local cache, sent up to C2, and made available to the other sites on demand should they ever need to get access to that data. Likewise, the remote users can still interact with a Synology NAS that is closest to them through Synology Drive because hybrid share can be weaved into the Synology Drive platform to allow those remote users to access the Synology Drive web portal or to set up direct sync tasks to those Synology NAS. So now let's break down the different components that are going to be involved with this a little bit further. We have on the cloud side of things C2 Identity, and what C2 Identity is going to accomplish for us today is it's going to solve the challenges that are often in place for multi-site file serving. That's making sure your permissions and credentials are actually where they need to be. And what this is going to help accomplish is it's going to allow your remote users to authenticate with the Synology NAS through one credential, so they could even go into the office and still have the same credentials. And it's likewise if workers need to transfer between offices. C2 Identity can help with that because the individual Synology NAS devices are going to be edge LDAP servers, and there's C2 Identity agents that can be installed on your computers and servers to manage those easily directly inside the C2 Identity portal. Now, on the other hand, you have Synology C2 Storage, and this is a really flexible platform inside of the Synology C2 ecosystem. You can do either hyper backup tasks directly to Synology C2 Storage and or also use Synology C2 Storage as a live file serving location through the use of hybrid share. It's actually going to now become, in our case, the central hub for syncing between the different offices. So now let's take a closer look at what your end users will actually be interacting with day in and day out. They'll be actually interacting with the cloud sort of indirectly through their C2 Identity agent as well as through their local Synology NAS, either through the Synology Drive client interacting with the hybrid share folder or through SMB also interacting with that hybrid share folder and that local cache. So your end users will have that C2 Identity agent. Once they authenticate and log into their computer, they can then log into the NAS with the same credentials or map their network drives, for example. And if any users actually upload or change data in that local cache through SMB, for example, that'll first be transferred to their respective local NAS, It'll then be sent up to Synology C2 storage and made available at the secondary site on demand should they ever need that data. Simultaneously, the end users that are remote to their closest Synology NAS, they can interact with their hybrid share folder through Synology Drive, either through the Synology Drive web portal or through direct sync tasks that will then be sent to that local NAS first, and then again back up to Synology C2 storage to be made available on the other side should that other NAS ever need it. Now, the last couple components here that are going to be brought to the table are, of course, your end user's actual endpoint PCs and any mobile devices that they might want to use with the Synology Drive app on top of that. So now that we know our goal for today and we know the different components to get this accomplished, we're going to start off with our agenda so we know what our next steps are through the rest of the session. We're going to start off with C2 Identity. We're going to get our users and credentials all configured first so that whenever we get everything else configured, we're going to be able to begin using our hybrid file server pretty much immediately. We're then going to move into hybrid share, and we're going to start off by partitioning off our Synology C2 storage environment first, and then mounting those different hybrid share folders on our respective NAS devices in our West Coast and our East Coast offices. We're then going to move into some end user workflows that your users will be able to take advantage of now that you have a Synology hybrid file server. We're going to round things off with a disaster recovery scenario to show you how to gain access to your data on different equipment. So moving on to the next section, we're going to take a look at Synology C2 Identity. We're going to introduce it and also set it up in our demos here. Now, on this section, we're going to first take a look at what is C2 Identity because it is a fairly new platform and we want to make sure the entire Synology community is familiar with it. We're then going to move into why we chose C2 Identity for our specific deployment, and the main reason why is that it makes it a lot easier to deal with all of your permissions and user credentials by having a centralized identity management platform like Synology C2 Identity. We're then going to move into the actual setup and create each component to integrate our cloud, NAS, and endpoint devices like our PCs and servers that might be on site. So what is Synology C2 Identity? C2 Identity is a cloud-based identity management platform that allows you to centralize both your user and device level management from across your organization. It can also help you create a global single sign-on environment, allowing your users to use one set of credentials to access their on-premise resources like their PCs, their servers if they have permissions to them, the Synology NAS, alongside any cloud-based resources they need to log into, may that be Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace. Now, even if you're not using one of those Google or Microsoft environments, C2 Identity supports custom SAML2 integrations. So if you're using another third-party cloud platform that works with that standard, we can integrate there as well. Also, C2 Identity can help you replace legacy directory options because you can manage your users and your devices from one location. However, if you have an Active Directory environment you want to keep in place, with a recent update, C2 Identity now supports integration there as well. So why are we choosing C2 Identity in our environment? First off, it's cost effective. It's free for one Edge LDAP device. We have a need for more than one Edge LDAP server, so we're going to use the paid plan. But this paid plan is still cheaper than using multiple Windows Server licenses for multiple locations. On top of that, there's easy management. C2 Identity is a cloud-based platform, so we can access and manage the global domain from anywhere we have an internet connection. Also, C2 Identity is multi-site by design. So what that means is the paid plan offers up to 25 Edge LDAP servers in that environment. So you could have up to 25 different branch locations actually integrating back to C2 Identity and to that single C2 Identity domain. So let's go ahead and set up our C2 Identity environment. First off, we're going to configure C2 Identity on the cloud side. We're going to set up the domain, users, and groups. We're then going to integrate the Synology NAS by creating an Edge LDAP server for that on-site authentication. Lastly, we're going to install the identity agent on the endpoint PCs and servers we want a part of the environment. So let's go ahead and check this all out. Here we are inside of our Synology C2 account portal. And you'll notice we've already chosen our C2 Identity domain name. And this will be one of the first things you're prompted to do whenever you log into C2 Identity on the cloud side for the first time. So what we've chosen for our environment is the Synology America Corp unique domain name for our environment. Now we're going to move into adding in users to our domain. You can import users and groups from an existing LDAP or Active Directory environment, but we're going to add users in manually in our case. So I'm going to begin filling out these fields for my personal credentials for this environment. And keep in mind, if you expand to show more, you're going to be able to add in additional details for the user or worker in your environment, like what department they're a part of. On the next screen, we're going to be able to choose how we want to activate this user. You can send an activation email, you can specify a password, or you can activate later. Keep in mind, if you specify a password and don't choose the generated password, you're still going to have to respect the password requirements inside of Synology C2 Identity, so no simple passwords in this case. Now underneath that, you can choose whether or not to assign a license to this user by default, and we're going to leave that enabled in our environment. As we click through the different menus here, you're going to notice that we're going to jump ahead to when we've added in several more users to our environment. Next on the docket is actually adding in endpoint PCs under Managed Devices, applications like Microsoft 365 if you're using them, and Edge LDAP servers to your C2 Identity environment. We're going to start off with Managed Devices, which are the endpoint PCs, servers, and macOS devices you want a part of your identity domain. So you're going to download whichever agent applies to the device you want to add, and also copy your connect key, because you're going to need that whenever you go to install the agent. With that being said, we're going to hop over to a Windows device that we're going to install this agent on. And just like any other wizard for any other software you're going to be installing on a Windows device, you're just going to click through this installation wizard, accept the license agreement, and it's really as simple as just copying in that connect key you copied from the previous menu. Now, once we finish this install, you're going to be prompted to restart the machine. And we're going to go ahead and abide by that and go ahead and restart this device. Now, as this is restarting, we're going to hop back over to our C2 Identity environment and actually approve this device for our environment so it can begin syncing the credentials and permissions that are required to actually access this PC for your C2 Identity users. Next, we're going to add in Edge servers, which are going to be the Synology NAS in this case. And as we click the Add Edge Server button, you're going to notice you're prompted to actually download and install the package from Package Center on the Synology NAS. Keep in mind, you also want to copy this connect key as well. So we're on our Synology NAS device here for our West Coast Seattle location. So we're going to go to Package Center first and go ahead and install the C2 Identity Edge LDAP server. Now, once we click install, just like installing any other Synology package, it's pretty much automatic. You just have to click a couple buttons as you work through these menus. Now, once this is all installed, we're going to go ahead and open the Synology C2 Edge LDAP server for identity, and we're going to type in our server display name, what it's going to be named in C2 Identity, and also copy in the connect key. And that'll bring it into the Synology C2 Identity environment as an Edge LDAP server. We're going to do the same thing on our secondary device in the East Coast office, the Washington, D.C. location. And we're going to hop back over to the admin portal for Synology C2 Identity and also approve these devices. So they're approved to be Synology C2 Identity Edge LDAP servers. So they'll get all of the users and credentials imported on them. So pretty much at this point, after you've added in your managed devices, any applications you're using, and Edge servers, you're going to be able to then log in with these different devices using your C2 Identity credentials. So pretty much your domain is set up at this point. Now, moving into the hybrid share introduction and setup, let's go ahead and start off with our agenda for this section. First off, we're going to take a look at the components of hybrid share and really understand what makes this new platform tick. On top of that, we're going to go ahead and check out the benefits for hybrid share and why you might want to use hybrid share in your hybrid file server environment. We're going to round things off by checking out the setup and tips that we have and really just some best practices for utilizing this hybrid platform. So let's talk about the hybrid share cloud components. On one hand, you have C2 storage, and this is the cloud storage, your expandable data lake that actually houses your C2 hybrid share folder. Your hybrid share folder is actually the partition space in C2 storage that is mounted by your Synology NAS whenever you go to mount your hybrid share folder in DSM. Now, your hybrid share local components are your hybrid share service, and this is that NAS service that handles all hybrid share activity to and from the C2 storage environment. Now, your local cache is the reserved space on your local BTRFS volume that keeps your most recently accessed files local for higher speed access over your LAN. Now, let's talk a little bit about the benefits of hybrid share and C2 storage being used in tandem. First off, you get end-to-end encryption, and this is FIPS-compliant encryption while communicating with C2 storage, and also there's encryption at rest. On top of that, there's high levels of resiliency and flexibility, so you can grow your C2 storage environment as your business grows, even if your data demand is increasing aggressively. Also, this whole environment, just like C2 Identity, was multi-site by design. And you can have multiple NAS access the same hybrid share folder to solve cross-site syncing issues because your C2 storage environment is the central hub for syncing for all the other locations. On top of that, your local cache provides high-speed access to files over LAN, and there's also some tiering functionality there through a least recently used algorithm. If your hybrid share local cache gets full and you still need to add additional data to it, it will evict older data that you haven't accessed in a while and save that copy up to the C2 storage cloud and make room for that new data that you're uploading. So by using your Synology NAS through Hybrid Share alongside C2 storage, you gain the privacy, security, and speed you get whenever you're using your local NAS over your LAN, mixed with the availability, scalability, and flexibility you gain from using a public cloud service like Synology C2 storage. So let's go over some setup tips and best practices before we dive into the demo. You first want to partition your C2 storage. You're going to be setting up a quota for your Hybrid Share folder, and you're essentially determining how much storage you want utilized for Hybrid Share versus Hyper Backup, because C2 storage can be used for both. You then want to size your local cache to meet your organization's needs. Now, Synology recommends that you size your local cache to be able to handle around 2 weeks of your normal workload. The reason being is you'll always have your most recently accessed files on demand over your local network speeds. If you size your local cache a little too small, then you might have excessive swapping with C2 storage and you won't be getting the best performance possible out of your local cache. You then want to consider some relevant thresholds with Hybrid Share. For example, the minimum local cache is 500 gigabytes, so you need to be able to accommodate that. On top of that, the maximum file upload is 128 gigabytes, and your local cache shouldn't be more than 80% of your BTRFS volume. The reason being is if you dumped a lot of data into your local cache of your Hybrid Share folder, it can actually occupy a little bit more of your BTRFS volume, so it can actually finish the upload to C2. So you need to have a little bit of wiggle room so it can actually finish that operation. So let's check everything out. So here we are in our Synology C2 storage environment, and you'll notice that we have around 1 terabyte of storage that we can play with for Hyper Backup and Hybrid Share in our case. Now, as we click through the menus, you notice we don't have anything set up just yet, so we're going to go to the Hybrid Share tab, and we're going to hit Create. We're first going to name our Hybrid Share folder and give it a folder quota. The folder quota is essentially partitioning off this 1 terabyte of space for use in our Hybrid Share environment. Keep in mind the minimum for the folder quota on the cloud side is 500 gigabytes. Now, once we have that Hybrid Share folder all created, you're going to notice it's uninitialized. And this is important because if we go into our snapshot menu, which is snapshotting for the cloud side of this data, you're going to notice that we're going to be unable to enable our actual snapshot policy because we don't have the Hybrid Share folder initialized yet. We don't have a Synology NAS mounted to it yet and the encryption key set up. So what we're going to do is hop over to our Synology NAS device and get back to that snapshot policy in just a little bit. We're going to go to Control Panel, Shared Folder, and hit Create to mount our Hybrid Share folder. We're going to follow through this wizard, and first off, we're going to grant access to C2 storage for this specific Synology NAS. So we're going to click Allow, and Next, and then we're going to choose that Synology Hybrid Share folder that we just created a couple moments ago. Now, since it's the first time we are actually mounting this Hybrid Share folder, we're going to need to set up our encryption key. Now, keep in mind this is a permanent encryption key, and there's no way to recover it if it is lost. So make sure you keep it in a safe place. Now, once that's all set up, we can go ahead and name our Hybrid Share folder. And also, you'll notice that we had the Hybrid Share key actually downloaded to our web browser. So make sure you move that off of your computer once you're done with this whole process. But we will need it whenever we mount the Hybrid Share folder on our second NAS. We can then choose our local cache size, but keep in mind, you want to size the local cache to work for you for about 2 weeks of normal usage. The reason being is by sizing your local cache correctly, you can really reap the full benefits of having a hybrid cloud solution like Hybrid Share. Now, once we finish clicking through this wizard, you're going to notice that we are now connected to our Hybrid Share folder and all of that good stuff. We are going to also need to set up our permissions for our C2 identity users because this NAS is joined to our C2 identity domain. So we're going to click on our Hybrid Share folder and go ahead and move into the Edit menu. Now, once we're in the Edit menu, we're going to want to go over to our Permissions tab right here, and we're going to go ahead and move down to LDAP users. Now, we can add permissions for the C2 Hybrid Share folder on an individual user-by-user basis. And you'll notice these are our C2 identity users. You can see our Synology AmeriCorp domain listed right next to the username. So we can add in permissions for this Hybrid Share folder using the checkboxes for individual users. You can also go to LDAP groups and also apply this to groups that you have set up in your C2 identity domain so that you can apply permissions to many users in just one fell swoop. So now that we have our user permissions all figured out for our C2 Hybrid Share integration, we're going to move to our secondary location on our East Coast office and also apply this device to our Hybrid Share folder and mount the Hybrid Share on this device. So we're going to click Create and Mount Hybrid Share, and we're going to work through this wizard once more. Now keep in mind this wizard is pretty much exactly the same as before. We're going to grant access to our C2 storage environment, mount the same hybrid share. The only difference is you're not setting up the encryption key this time. You're going to be typing it in or importing it. And then once you have this all set up and your local cache reserved for this secondary device, now both of your Synology NAS devices are integrated into your hybrid share environment and the C2 identity domain. Now that we have those two devices integrated and everything's ready to go to be loaded into our hybrid share environment, we want to make sure we have our backup plan in place on the cloud side. So what we're going to do is head into our C2 storage environment and we're going to edit our snapshot policy and we're going to go ahead and enable it for a daily snapshot. Now keep in mind you can have a maximum of 32 snapshots in your environment and you can easily roll back your hybrid share folder if anything were to happen to it. Now that we have our hybrid share snapshot policy in place, we can begin using our hybrid share folder easily and securely. So let's go ahead and dive into our end user workflows. Now first off, your end users are going to need to log into their endpoint PCs through their C2 identity credentials. Now, the C2 Identity Agent is actually going to be another option on the login screen for Windows, for example. And what they're going to do is click that C2 Identity icon, and then they're going to be able to log in utilizing their C2 Identity credentials. So let's take a look at how this workflow is going to be, how your end users are actually going to log in to their PCs now through their C2 Identity credentials. So here we are in our Windows device, and this is going to be logging in for the first time for your end users using your C2 identity credentials. And you'll notice on this main menu here, once we begin the sign-in process, there's an option for other users right below your normal user for the PC, and there's the C2 identity logo right next to it. So we're going to click on that and actually type in our C2 identity username and then our password, and then that will get us logged in for the very first time to this Windows device using our C2 identity credentials. Now that our end users are all logged in, they can begin utilizing hybrid share through SMB, just mapping some network drives on Windows, for example. So we're going to show you how to map the network drives and request new data just through SMB. And what's really awesome about this integration is if your end users are used to using a file server in a normal Windows environment, the workflow, the learning curve for this is completely minimal. It's like using any other file server. Just on the back end, it's enabled and powered by hybrid share and the Synology C2 cloud environment. So here we are on our West Coast Synology NAS, and we're going to show you how you can interact with your hybrid share environment through FileStation as well as through mapped drives on a Windows device, for example. So we're going to open up FileStation here and drill down into our hybrid share folder. As we drill down into this and into the subfolders, you're going to notice that a lot of these files have a green check mark next to them underneath the status column. That means that these files live on the local cache as well as the Synology C2 cloud. Likewise, as we hop back over to our East Coast office and drill down into that hybrid share folder mount, we can still see all the different subfolders and the files, but there's a cloud icon next to them in the status column. Now what that means is that these different files and folders are available on demand from C2, but they don't live on the local cache just yet. So we can actually get this data into the local cache in a couple different ways. We can pin it to the local cache permanently, and what that means is that it never gets evicted from the local cache regardless of the swap mechanism inside of hybrid share. Likewise, we can easily download any one of these files or folders just like you would in a normal shared folder inside of FileStation. It will automatically start downloading to your browser. It just requests it from C2 first, brings it into the local cache, and then begins the download. As we refresh, you'll notice that that folder or file that we just requested now has a green check mark next to it showing that is now on the local cache. Likewise, we can upload a file on this East Coast side here. And we're going to choose just a normal Excel CSV file, for example. We're just going to choose book 1 in our case. Now, as we upload this book 1 Excel file into our environment on the East Coast office, if we go over to a Windows device that has a mapped drive to our West Coast NAS, we can drill down into the different hybrid share folders, we can see all the subfolders, and we can also see that CSV file, that book1.csv file that we uploaded in the hybrid share folder on FileStation on the East Coast office, but this time we're seeing it through SMB on the West Coast office. So that shows the full integration of hybrid share through normal file protocols and FileStation on your Synology NAS. Lastly, we have our Synology Drive and hybrid share integration. So we're going to show you how you can use hybrid share as a remote worker to create sync tasks and access data remotely. Even though a lot of that data could be housed in the cloud, you can still create sync tasks and interact with it through the Synology Drive environment. So here we are on our Synology NAS device. Let's incorporate HybridShare into this Synology Drive instance. So what we're going to do first is we're going to open up the main menu and open the Synology Drive admin console. Keep in mind we already have the Synology Drive server as a whole installed on the Synology NAS. So as we open up the Synology Drive admin console, we're going to move down to the Team Folder tab. Now, Team Folders is where you can incorporate normal shared folders into your Synology Drive environment. And we can do the same thing with the HybridShare folder because it's treated essentially the same as a normal shared folder. So we can select this and click Enable and set up versioning for your HybridShare folder. And that's a good thing, actually, because we already have versioning on the cloud side, but this Synology Drive versioning for the HybridShare folder provides versioning for your local cache. So once we click through the menus here, we now have the HybridShare folder fully incorporated into our Synology Drive instance, and now we can begin syncing with this HybridShare folder and interacting with it through the Synology Drive web portal. So let's go ahead and check that out. We're going to go back into the main menu here, and we're going to open up the Synology Drive web portal. Now, as you can see under Team Folder, we can see our HybridShare folder, and as we drill down into it, we're going to be able to see all those folders and files that we had uploaded previously. Now, keep in mind, this folder is essentially treated the same way as any other shared folder that would be in Synology Drive. So we can go ahead and select one of these files here and click Download, for example, and it'll immediately download through our web browser. And if it wasn't already in the local cache on this NAS, we could easily just click the download button and have it download after it reaches the NAS from Synology C2. Likewise, you can also easily share your HybridShare data through Synology Drive. You can do an internal share and provide permissions to other users on the NAS or your C2 identity domain from the first menu, and on the second menu you can create a public sharing link. Likewise, you can also upload files on this HybridShare through Synology Drive and have it reflected throughout the rest of the HybridShare environment. So we're going to upload a few different photos here. And you'll notice that we're uploading it into our cross-site data inside of our HybridShare folder through the Synology Drive web portal on the Washington, D.C. side of things. And if we go to our West Coast NAS here, go into File Station and look at the HybridShare folder, you're going to see that that data that we uploaded on the Synology Drive side on the East Coast NAS is also visible and available on demand on the other side of the relationship on our West Coast NAS. That shows that you can interact with HybridShare through all kinds of different means. You can interact with it through Synology Drive, the web portal, and you can also interact with it through File Station SMB and have it reflected throughout the entire environment. So let's shift gears here and also interact with HybridShare through a sync task using Synology Drive. You'll notice we're on a Windows environment right now, and we already have the Synology Drive client set up. So we're going to pair back to our Washington, D.C. NAS once more. And we're going to set up a sync task. There's also some backup tasks options for Synology Drive, but we're just going to set up a sync task today. So now we're going to set up how we want to actually do this sync. We're going to set up our team folder, our HybridShare folder as our NAS sync destination. And we're actually going to drill down and have the main folder that we sync to be deliverables, for example. So now if we upload our deliverable documents to the local sync folder, it would automatically be placed in HybridShare and distributed out to the other devices. Now we're going to select our local location, and that's going to be the Synology Drive and HybridShare folder we already have created. We're going to uncheck this box to create an empty Synology Drive folder because we just want to use the folder that we have listed here rather than creating another Synology Drive folder underneath that. So now that we have all of our sync set up, it can begin the full syncing process after we're done with that wizard. So we're going to go ahead and allow it to apply changes. And we're going to go ahead and click through some of these menus. It's basically just showing you all the benefits of Synology Drive here. But now we're going to go ahead and open our folder that we are syncing to on our local device. And right as we do so, you're going to be able to see all the different data inside of our deliverables folder, for example. So we can create another folder inside of this directly through our Windows environment. And you can see on the bottom right that it's automatically making these changes to HybridShare and syncing it to the Synology NAS it's paired with. So we're going to start dumping in some new files here. And we have a few files now in our deliverable folder. And we're going to hop back over to our Synology NAS that we're syncing with through that Synology Drive client. As we open up Synology Drive admin console, this is just proving that we are paired back to this Synology NAS using our C2 identity credentials. Likewise, whenever we open up File Station, we can now see in our HybridShare folder all of that data that we created in that deliverables folder through our Synology Drive sync task. Once again, showing that you can interact with HybridShare just like any other team folder, or shared folder. You can use a multitude of different avenues through the Synology Drive web portal, a sync client, file station, and even SMB, and have it reflected across the entire environment. As you can see, even though we synced from one endpoint PC to a Synology NAS on the East Coast, we can also see that data on our West Coast NAS and file station. So remember that diagram that we had at the beginning of the event? Our goal is now accomplished. We have C2 storage set up for hybrid share, and we have C2 identity all stood up and the domain created. We have our local NAS as the edge LDAP servers for C2 identity, and they're housing local cache for the hybrid share folder that they're mounted. And our on-site users can now access those local NAS through normal file protocols like SMB. And as you saw, the learning curve for accessing that data is extremely small, as long as your users have actually utilized a Windows file server in the past. Now, we also have our offsite users, our remote users, that can access that same hybrid share folder through Synology Drive's web portal or through direct sync tasks to their endpoint PCs. What's great about this whole solution here is all of this can be done simultaneously. You don't have to have only on-site users or only remote users. They can all simultaneously access the hybrid share folder just through different avenues. So we're going to take a look at our final section for today, disaster recovery. And in this section, we're going to take a look at some disaster challenges, which are challenges with standing up a brand new file server that most admins are probably pretty familiar with. And then we're going to take a look at the resolution, which is just actionable solutions to getting back up and running quickly and efficiently. So on to the challenges. Of course, a brand new file server is difficult to reconfigure. You may have a bunch of other settings you need to change on other platforms. And there's a lot of downtime usually whenever you're standing up a new file server because you're transferring all your data over regardless of need, especially if you're in a bare metal restore. It can take a fair amount of time depending on how large that data is in that bare metal restore. So let's go over the steps to resolve this. First, after taking delivery of your new replacement NAS, you're going to want to install the NAS operating system, and that is DSM or Disk Station Manager. And after you get that all installed, you're going to want to apply the config file that you might have backed up through your Synology account originally. And this is a new feature inside of DSM-7. Now, what this is all going to accomplish is it's going to get all of the checkbox changes that you made and all the settings that you made on the previous NAS applied to your new replacement NAS. Next, you're going to want to join this NAS to your identity domain by downloading and installing from Package Center, the C2 Identity Edge LDAP server, so you have all of your credentials and users now locally on this NAS once more. Next, you're going to go ahead and mount your hybrid share folder that still exists inside of C2 storage. All of your data is still there. So you can just easily mount that C2 storage environment, that hybrid share folder, and gain access to that data. Last on the list is just making sure you map all your drives to the new Synology NAS and make sure that your Synology Drive clients are pointing at the new device. What's great about this whole restore is it's not a full bare metal restore. What you're really just doing is joining the domain and mounting the hybrid share folder, and then you can pull data down as needed. Whereas a bare metal restore, the time that takes will depend on how large the data is. So here we are on our brand new Synology NAS. We're going to get this incorporated into our environment. Now, as we move to the main menu, what you're going to notice first is we already have our C2 Identity Edge LDAP server installed from Package Center. Now, first we want to go to Control Panel and go to Update and Restore and go to Configuration Backup, and you could click the Restore DSM Configurations button if you have a config file you want to apply. Again, this will be applying all the small settings and checkboxes you might have changed on your previous NAS to this new one, and you can even restore this from your Synology account if you had that backed up there already. Now, once you've applied that config file, what we're going to do first is actually get this all reincorporated into our C2 Identity environment. So once again, we're going to open up our C2 Identity Edge LDAP server, apply a server display name, and also type in our connect key. Now, once we hit connect, you want to make sure you go back into the admin portal like we did previously and approve this device for your C2 Identity domain. Now you have your users and all that stuff now on the Synology NAS once again. Now what we need to do is actually mount that hybrid share folder, and it's pretty much the same process as we saw last time. We're going to grant access to C2 storage for this Synology NAS. We're going to mount that same hybrid share folder, and we're also going to type in our encryption key for that hybrid share folder, just like we did previously. Next, we're also going to set up our local cache threshold. We're just going to leave it for 500 gigabytes in our case, which is the minimum. And once that's all finished, we now have the Synology NAS reincorporated into our environment. And that's how simple it is to recover in a disaster recovery scenario using this hybrid file server. Instead of having to do a full bare metal restore, you can just rejoin the domain, mount the hybrid share folder, apply your permissions, And then you can begin requesting that data down on demand rather than restoring terabytes and terabytes of data that you might not actually need. You can just request the data that you need to get back up and running as quickly as possible. So let's say time is of the essence and you didn't have an extra Synology NAS on hand. You still have options available to you for extracting data out of your HybridShare folder through the HybridShare download tool. Now this is a very similar tool to the Hybrid Backup Explorer that allows you to pull backup data out of C2 storage even if you don't have a Synology NAS. This is just specific to HybridShare. So you can use this tool to log in with your admin credentials and pull down data from your HybridShare folder on demand from anywhere you have an internet connection. So use this if you can't get your hands on a new Synology NAS to do that restoration on. So we went over quite a bit today. Let's recap and go over some next steps. We started off with C2 Identity, which is a cloud-based identity management platform that allows you to create a global domain and permissions for use across your organization, even if you have multiple sites. We then went over HybridShare and C2 storage and how these can work with your Synology NAS and DSM-7 to create a hybrid file server environment. We then touched on end-user workflows, and these are the different options that are available to your workers and your organization now that you use C2 Identity, HybridShare, and C2 storage in tandem with your Synology NAS. Lastly, we touched on disaster recovery workflows for how to get your NAS reincorporated into your Synology C2 Identity domain and remounted to your HybridShare folder. Now, if you need any additional help past what this webinar provides, go ahead and check out our Synology Partner Online training page. It's a library of hours and hours of video content that covers a wide range of topics. Now, if you need help past that Synology Partner Online training page and past what this webinar provides, go ahead and check out our knowledge base. All of our Synology knowledge lives there. Lastly, if you need any help past that, go ahead and send us an inquiry, and our highly trained inquiry team will be able to get your questions answered. Now, if you're a business user with your own internal IT team, go ahead and reach out to onboarding@synologyamerica.com. We have an end user team that can help get a build spec'd out for you. Now, channel partners, if you need to get in touch with your technical account manager, go ahead and reach out to sac_sales@synology.com, and we'll get you in touch with your account manager. With that said, that wraps things up for today. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.